So God, this morning we, obviously this is a big time of year that we celebrate, but what we're celebrating is actually that you've come to set us free and to feel that freedom, to feel that purpose, to feel that identity, and that this is more than just, sitting around a Christmas tree or anything like that, but there is a real meaning and a real depth to what we're doing here today. And so we just thank you for that. In your name we pray. Everyone said, Amen. You guys can have a seat. Well, Merry Christmas, you guys. It's good to see you. If you're new here, my name is John Wagler, and I'm part of the team, and just so thankful that you chose to be here, and you made a really good decision. And here's why. Our 9 o'clock service was probably like 80% full, and as you can see, we're at capacity, but our 4 o'clock is going to be a lot worse than this. So good call coming to the 11. So good job. But if you are new here, what Lacey said earlier is just very true. We really are trying to create space for people to safely explore and ask questions about what it means to actually have a faith in Jesus. And so if you are looking for a home church, if you don't have one already, we'd love to have you. And so just thank you so much for, you could have been anywhere else today. And so it's truly an honor that you chose to be here, here at Hill City. We love to celebrate Christmas, and we love to do it in a fun way, but we really want to get into the depth of everything too. So there's this guy, and you've probably heard of him before. There's this guy. He's obsessed with the word great. He became known for really building great buildings and real estate and about a lot of money. He came into power and really would try to connect with other people, authoritative people throughout the world, and he would kind of like suck up to them or kiss up to them a little bit for his own selfish gain. His family in and of itself was pretty unethical, and the people around him were always getting in trouble, did some really like crazy things, and even sometimes actually killing other people, and was always like insecure about anyone else who would come in to possibly threaten his power. And the name of that person is Herod the Great. All right, you guys, you don't probably thought I was taking a very different direction, but that's Herod the Great. And in this story with Herod, it's interesting. We kind of gloss over the story in and of itself because, we see these little parts of his story, but you know what else happened in his story? And this is the stuff we already know as part of Herod's reign, was that Jesus is born, right? As the story goes, to Mary, who was a virgin. And then there was some controversy there because with Joseph and everything. And then the shepherds come and see, and there's a star, and there's angels involved in the story. And then later on, like a year or two later, these magi come and they visit Herod, and they say, hey, we're here to see the king. And Herod's just freaking out. And so he gets his religious counselors together. And he's like, what are these guys talking about? And they all tell him, hey, these Jewish folks have been like waiting for this Messiah, this Savior to come. It's been told like a long time ago. So they've just been waiting. And they believe that's what the magi are talking about here. And so Herod's like, all right, kill all the babies or all the kids 2 years old and under, right? And so we know that part of the story. And we gloss over that part of the story too often. I think when Christmas comes around, we get all hyped up with what kind of culture kind of pushes in and everything else. And I think, and it's unfortunate, but I think sometimes we miss out on the depth. We miss out on the meaning why, like for instance today, why so many people are going to be in churches. Why is that? Why is it? And there's something more to this. And if we miss out on the something more, then Christmas is insufficient for us this year. And so I want to tap into that. One of the guys that did was actually this guy named John. He was one of the eyewitnesses and best friends of Jesus. And he wrote this letter back so people could kind of hear what he was talking about. And he wrote a fascinating start to the life of Jesus. It was different than some of the other people talked about. He was trying to bring people into a whole different mindset. And that's what I want to do for all of us here today. So in John chapter 1, I'm going to read a few verses there, and I want you to see how John described Jesus. He says it this way: in the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He existed in the beginning with God. God created everything through him, and nothing was created except through him. The Word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. So I'm going to pause there. As you can see on the screen, it says it's a capital W for word. And so he's saying that there's something more significant to this word. It's something that's more than simply a spoken word, that there's more layers to this. And you see what he's trying to establish is this transcendence about the word, that the word was always around. The word had always existed. It was there at creation, and that the word means something more. There's a transcendence to this whole God thing. There's a transcendence to this whole Jesus thing, because Jesus is the light that pervades the darkness of life. And so John's really trying to push into this. And so he continues in verse 6. He says, "Then God sent a man, John the Baptist," who's a different John. He said, "to tell about the light so that everyone might believe because of his testimony. John himself was not the light. He was simply a witness to tell about the light. The one who is the true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world." And so he says he's coming into the world. Why is he saying that? That's why we sing, O come, Emmanuel." It means God with us. And there's this intimacy. So John's establishing this transcendence, and then he's also bringing in this intimate part that he's saying, hey, there's supposed to be relationship here. There's transcendence, and then there's intimacy. He's telling this different story about God. He continues, he says, "He came into this very world he created, but the world didn't recognize him. He came to his own people, and even they rejected him. But to all who believed in him and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. They are reborn, not with a physical birth, but resulting from human passion or plan, but a birth that comes from God. So the Word became human and made his home among us." I'm going to pause there again. I promise we'll get through it. And made his home among us. It's this idea that he tabernacled. Now, get this. John is writing this primarily to Jewish listeners at that time. And so they would have been tapping into this thought, or like, all right, they know about the tabernacle. Now, why would they have known about the tabernacle? See, what John was doing is he brings these people into the story, and he says, hey, remember all the way back in creation. So he's starting where it was this perfect creation, and God was with us, and everything was good. And then something broke that, and we call it sin. And so something broke it, and the sin causes brokenness in the world. And then John is trying to get them to see, then God was still with us. God said, hey, I've got a plan to correct all of this stuff. And so he kind of builds this story. And then part of that plan was as he frees the Israelites, the Jewish people, out of the Exodus, they build a tent to house the presence of God. And it was known as the tabernacle. And so this idea of the tabernacle was so significant to the listener, because even after that, then in the temple, there was the tabernacle in there where they would house the presence of God. And so whenever they would be near the tabernacle, they thought to themselves, man, this is the presence of God. And so when John says that Jesus tabernacled with us, it's saying that the presence of God was with us. And that became this important twist to this whole story. So John continues on, and he says, he was full of unfailing love, which means grace, and faithfulness, which means truth. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. John testified about him when he shouted to the crowds, this is the one I was talking about when I said, someone is coming after me who is far greater than I am, for he existed long before me. From his abundance, we have all received one gracious blessing after another. And I want us to focus on grace today, because here's why. Grace is the thing that sets Christmas apart. You take away grace, and you have no Christmas. You might be thinking, no, I'm a very ungracious person, and I still love Christmas. But no, you take away grace from the meaning of Christmas, and it's gone. See, grace is what separates Christianity from all other belief systems. Grace is what enables us to recognize Jesus. Grace is the thing that we all need. And in one other translation says, we need grace on top of grace. That's what this whole message is really about. But here's the thing. That we don't fully understand what grace is. And so we miss it. There was no grace in Herod. And what did he want to do? He wanted to kill Jesus. He didn't recognize him. The religious people at that time, they weren't full of grace. And so they didn't recognize him either. And guess what they did? They did kill him. We don't have the ability to kill Jesus. But when we lack grace, we won't recognize him, and we kill the effects of Jesus in our life. And so it changes everything. So grace is this pivot point. So I want to highlight a few things about what grace is, because here's the question that has been bothering me for like the last probably 7 or 8 weeks leading up to this sermon, because I think about this stuff all the time in questions and in conversations with people about maybe some things they want to pick apart with Christianity, and I love those conversations. But this whole idea of grace led to this one simple question that I want you to take in today, and that's this: why wouldn't you want this to be true? I get it. There's some crazy elements to this story, from a virgin having birth to angels to a whole slew of other things. But why wouldn't you want this to be true? And I mean really true. Because if it is, it changes everything. If this whole grace thing is legitimate and true, it changes everything. And it will change everything for how you think about your own life. But if it isn't true, hey, you do you, okay? You do whatever you want to do, because if it isn't true, it just doesn't matter in the end. But if it is true, it changes everything. So here are a few things with grace that I want us to pay attention to. The first thing is this: that grace isn't fair. It isn't fair. Life isn't fair either, but grace isn't fair. And the second that we think we deserve grace, it's no longer grace, right? So grace isn't fair. You didn't deserve the grace you've received from God. I didn't deserve the grace that I've received from God, but God does it anyway. Grace is not fair. You might be thinking to yourself, yeah, but Wags, you don't know my story. You don't know what I think about myself. You don't know the decisions that I've made. You don't know, God would never want someone like me. And I'm telling you, he does. I'm telling you that his message is so powerful, that his grace overcomes anything that you've ever done. And that's how much that he truly desires you and loves you and what he thinks of you. That grace is that big of a deal. The kind of, when you look at the construct of the Bible and the stories of the Bible, it is just littered with stories about like a liar, a cheater, a murderer, an adulterer, people who are power hungry, greedy. You name it, and it's in the Bible. You name whatever decrepit behavior you've ever heard of or thought of or maybe even done yourself, and it's in the Bible. And then what we start seeing is God still offers grace within it. To anyone who wants it, to anyone who's humble enough to accept it. You see, God didn't come, and when we celebrate this God with us, he didn't come for those who think they got it all together. He came for those that are humble enough to know that they don't have it all together, that we do deserve grace, or that we do need grace, that it is like this incredible gift. The theological definition of grace is simply this, that it's unmerited favor from God, right? And so that's like that sounds good, but it doesn't practically do us any good. And so I came up with a definition that's more in practical nature, and it's this: that grace is God saying, I want you to see you as I do and experience who you were meant to be. That grace is God looking at you and saying, I need you to see yourself like I see you. And when you do that, here's the thing that will change. You'll start living who you were truly meant to be, the best version of yourself. That grace actually leads us to something or for something. It doesn't just, like sometimes we think, oh, this is grace from something. No, it's grace leads us to or for something or towards something. And that is towards real purpose, towards real identity, towards actual freedom in your life. You see, the issue that I think sometimes that we miss out on is we like cheap grace. We like the grace that we like the idea of grace. We're like, yes, Jesus, yes. I love Christmas. Yeah, like I'll see you on Easter. Like we love Jesus and like that whole thing. And like we love that part of grace. But here's what, that's cheap grace. Here's what happens. We want the easy way out. Cheap grace is wanting the easy way out. Cheap grace is always looking for a loophole. Cheap grace is saying, I don't want to be challenged. Cheap grace is saying, I don't want to actually, you know what, God, you can have one part of my life, but you're not touching this part. That's cheap grace. But see, grace really becomes this pivot point. Even the actual definition of how they expressed it within the time frame back then was really flipped everything upside down. Charis is the word that was used for it, and that was a gift that was given to someone who deserved it. And so when the initial thought of Christianity and what Jesus would teach was something so different, saying you don't deserve it. I know I didn't deserve it. I didn't earn any of this grace. You didn't earn any of this grace. Like when you say, like, I'm a good person, who are we comparing ourselves to? Always someone that's worse than us, right? No one's ever like, you know what? They're so much better than me. We like that when we talk about grace and how good we always compare ourselves to someone who's, quote unquote, less than us. But are we really that great? No, we don't deserve that kind of grace. And so you might be even sitting with someone or brought someone, you might be thinking this, they don't deserve that kind of grace. Don't side-eye them right now, but you might be thinking, they're nasty, right? They don't deserve that grace. Well, God takes in all of that. It's like, no. My grace is bigger than that. Grace, the second thing here is that grace says we are accepted. So grace isn't fair, but grace says that we are accepted. And here's what's just so powerful of this, that our acceptance comes from our Creator and not who we see in the mirror. See, when we really grasp this grace, it's not about what I think in the mirror, it's about what God thinks of me. And, some of you guys maybe have been in this scenario where you've looked in the mirror and you've thought, I don't like what I see. I don't like how I look. I don't like where my life is. I don't like what I've done. All those things. And it brings about insecurity. It brings about maybe a lack of trust in people. It brings about maybe some pain and some suffering that you've been through and some bad memories and everything else. But yet, when we grab grace and we are willing and humble enough to accept the grace that is given to us, what starts to change is we start seeing who God sees and not who we see. And then our life starts having real identity. Our life starts having real purpose and real freedom. That grace ends up bringing about the fact that, you know what, you do belong. As John wrote, that you become a child of God. That grace is this idea that how God sees us as one of his sons or one of his daughters. It's a pivotal thing. That it says you not only belong, but that you are accepted, that you are significant. God says that, who created every part of you. That's what he thinks of you. And that's what grace can do for us. But here's what culture does, right? Culture says, no. You've got to earn all of this. Culture says you got to achieve. Culture says you got to go. Culture says you got to embrace the hurry of everything. And what's the end result of that? Stress and worry and anxiety, comparison, insecurity. All of these things, we feel the weight of all of those things. And probably no more time, like the most appropriate time to even talk about that is right now. You guys have probably felt a little of that hurry. But here's what else that we know, that when hurry consumes us, we forget that God is with us. And we even sing that like Christmas carol, right? Of oh come, Emmanuel, like this, oh yes, God is with us. But hurry will interrupt that. Why? Because we care more about worry. We care more about what I don't have. We care about what's stressing me out. We care way more about that stuff than understanding and believing through the grace of God, that we get to experience the presence of God. That's what grace is. Grace is the only thing that can bring actual peace. Grace is the only thing that can bring actual peace. I want to read to you from a sermon from 51 years ago by this guy named Martin Luther King Jr. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's wrote some pretty powerful sermons. And I was reading this this week and just really started welling up with tears and at certain sections of it, because it's unbelievable how his words still ring so true today. And I want you to hear about the grace that's coming out from his words. He says this, and this was in 1967. This Christmas season finds us a rather bewildered human race. We have neither peace within nor peace without. Everywhere, paralyzing fears herald people by day and haunt them by night. Our world is sick with war. Everywhere we turn, we see its ominous possibilities. And yet, my friends, the Christmas hope for peace and goodwill toward all men can no longer be dismissed as a kind of pious dream of some utopian. If we don't have goodwill toward men in this world, we will destroy ourselves by the misuse of our own instruments and our own power. Still 100% true today. Now, let me suggest first that if we are to have peace on earth, our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Our loyalties must transcend race, our tribe, our class, our nation, and this means we must develop a world perspective. No individual can live alone. No nation can live alone. And as long as we try, the more we are going to have war in this world. Now, the judgment of God is upon us, and we must either learn to live together as brothers, or we are all going to perish together as fools. Still 100% true. I've seen too much hate to want to hate myself, and I've seen hate on the faces of too many sheriffs, too many white citizens counselors, and too many Klansmen of the South to want to hate myself. And every time I see it, I say to myself, hate is too great of a burden to bear. Somehow we must be able to stand up before our most bitter opponents and say, we shall match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with soul force. To do to us what you will, and we will still love you. We cannot in all good conscience obey your unjust laws and abide in the unjust system, because non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. And so throw us in jail and we will still love you. Bomb our homes and threaten our children, and as difficult as it is, we will still love you. Send your hooded perpetrators of violence in our communities at the midnight hour and drag us out to some wayside road and leave us half dead as you beat us, and we will still love you. Send your propaganda agents around the country and make it appear that we are not fit, culturally and otherwise, for integration, and we'll still love you. But be assured that we'll wear you down by our capacity to suffer, and one day we will win our freedom. We will not only win our freedom for ourselves, we will so appeal to your heart and conscience that we will win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory. You cannot write those words, you cannot have those thoughts, you cannot believe that's even possible without grace gripping your soul and gripping your heart. You cannot overcome racism or anything unjust in our country without grace. We cannot make the statement Christmas is about peace and goodwill towards men without grace. We can't ever think about, as we look to other people that might have a different perspective or a different opinion, we can't actually value who they are without grace. Grace is the only thing that can bring peace, real peace, lasting peace. Grace will be the only thing that will get you through that suffering time. Grace will be the thing that when you look at your past and maybe what has happened and you see that God's got a greater future for you. They have the peace of that in your soul. That only happens through grace. Grace inspires us to give our life away. Culture says to achieve more, but grace says to love more. Grace will motivate us to do good things for the right reasons. When we do good things for people for the wrong reasons or for our selfish, to make ourselves feel good, it's exhausting. But when we live our lives in response to the grace that we receive, you will experience this life with so much purpose. You will experience this life with so much freedom. You will experience this life like you never have before. Why? Because you've built on grace and not what you want, but what God has desired for us. Now, the last thing is this. Grace simplifies our life and keeps our vision clear. We like to find loopholes, don't we? If you've ever taken time to read the Bible or maybe heard something say, like maybe, well, Jesus taught this, and you've ever done this, I don't like that one. That's just a loophole. You're trying to find the loophole in the system. And you think when Jesus taught to love your enemies, he's like, yeah, but he didn't know mine. Let me contextualize that. It wasn't as bad back then, right? No. We like to find loopholes. But what grace does is say, no. I want to be obedient to the teachings of Jesus because I know that's where I find most purpose, most identity, most freedom. To have this life really worth living. Grace will stop you from finding loopholes and loving others too. That's pretty easy to do. But grace will say, you know what? No, I've got to love them through this. Now, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that because of grace you have to be stuck in a terrible relationship that's been hurtful. I'm not saying that you got to go back or around anyone that's been hurtful to you. I am saying that sometimes the most gracious thing you can do is have someone else suffer the consequences of their actions. There's been a few times where people have come to me and said, hey, so-and-so, my son, my uncle, my nephew, whatever it is, are going to be in court this week, and will you pray that the judge will have grace on them? And a couple times I've responded, no. And here's why. Because those same people have come to me and said, man, he just won't get it, or she just won't get it. And so sometimes I think, well, maybe suffering the consequences from the judge might be the most gracious thing God could ever do to help them learn the lesson. So sometimes that's grace. So it doesn't mean just let anything go, but here's what that grace will do for those people. It changes your heart. Unforgiveness only hurts you. It doesn't hurt anybody else. And so the grace that then you are able to then give out, you might be able to say, hey, they deserve the consequences, or I'm not going to even be in relationship with them anymore because they're so hurtful. But your grace that you're poured out is this. But you know what? I hope God wrecks their heart somehow. I hope somehow they come back. I hope somehow they see what grace really could mean and their life completely pivots around. Grace changes everything. Darrell and Natalie, you guys can come back up. So even though, for some of you guys, you might have been coming into this Christmas season not recognizing Jesus. Just so you know, Jesus recognizes you. You might have come into this, and you might have been thinking to yourself, Wags, man, this is my, Lord knows how many Christmas services I've done. How many times I've heard this Christmas story, how many times I've gone through this. But guess what? You could just as easily ignore Jesus this season. You could forget about the grace you've received because you've become kind of desensitized to grace. For some of you others, you've walked in here this morning and thought, man, I don't want to believe in this stuff. I don't need this. But I would say this to you. Why wouldn't you want this to be true? Why wouldn't you want this to be true? Because if it is a game changer. If it is, it changes every part of your very being. How you see yourself, how you see your life, how you treat people around you, how you are in your friendships, in your marriage, at work. Everything you do is changed by this idea of grace if it's true. See, grace is God's relentless and stubborn actions towards people that just don't deserve it. That's how much he loves you. That's how much he loves me. So then here's the thing. Then we've got to see, do we really want to accept that grace? You see, grace means forgiveness and compassion and kindness and generosity and all those things. Grace means that we look at the promises of God that he has established and said, you know what, I'm going to believe in those promises. Grace will say that I believe in the victory that through Jesus' death and resurrection, the grace that's there, I believe that the victory has already been done and already been won, and I can take rest in that through whatever pain, whatever suffering, whatever things that I'm going through, and know that God's got something greater in play. That's grace. So why wouldn't you want that to be true?